My beloved child. Your soulmate walked into that psychic reading with one question they had been almost embarrassed to ask. It wasn't whether you still loved them. It wasn't whether you would return. It wasn't even whether the two of you belonged together. They wanted to know about your money. Not because they were simply curious about what was in your bank account, but because someone had recently said something about your financial life that made them question everything they thought they understood about you. The comment had come during a casual conversation. Someone who knew pieces of your past looked across the table and said, almost carelessly, "You know, they were dealing with a lot more than they ever told you." Your soulmate frowned. What does that mean? The person hesitated. Then came the sentence that stayed with them for the rest of the night. They weren't trying to get something from you. If anything, they were trying to make sure you never knew how much they were carrying. Your soulmate didn't answer. Because that was not the version of the story they had been living with. And a few days later, when they found themselves sitting across from a psychic they had visited more out of confusion than belief, that conversation was still echoing in their mind. The room was quieter than they expected. No dramatic music. No theatrical predictions. Just a small table, a dim lamp, a deck of cards off to one side, and a woman who watched them carefully as they explained why they had come. Your soulmate began awkwardly. There was someone in my life. The psychic nodded. There usually is. Your soulmate almost smiled. Then they looked down at their hands. I need to know something about their financial situation. The psychic didn't immediately touch the cards. Instead, she asked a question that caught them off guard. Why? Your soulmate had prepared themselves to ask about you. They had not prepared themselves to explain what asking about your money said about them. For a moment, they said nothing. Then they admitted that money had always been one of the invisible tensions between you. Not necessarily because either of you was rich or poor. It was more complicated than that. Money represented security, control, independence, fear. It represented whether someone could be trusted when life became difficult. And somewhere along the way, your soulmate had formed an assumption about you. Maybe they thought you were struggling because you lacked direction. Maybe they believed you expected someone else to rescue you. Maybe they assumed your distance came from embarrassment. Maybe they heard somebody describe you as financially unstable and never bothered to ask what that actually meant. Or perhaps they looked at one difficult season in your life and mistook it for your entire character. That was the story they carried. Until now. The psychic finally said, "Before we talk about them, tell me what you actually know." That question changed the room. Because the answer was uncomfortable. Your soulmate knew less than they had pretended to know. They remembered things. A time when you declined an invitation and said you were busy. A moment when you quietly returned something you had purchased. A period when you worked longer hours but never explained why. The way you would occasionally become silent when conversations turned toward expensive plans. The way you insisted on paying your own share even when it would have been easier to accept help. At the time, your soulmate interpreted those moments through their own fears. Now, sitting there, another explanation began to form. What if you had never been trying to hide irresponsibility? What if you had been protecting your dignity? The psychic leaned back. You keep asking me whether this person has money. Your soulmate looked up. She continued. But I don't think money is the question bothering you. What is? I think you're afraid you misunderstood why they pulled away. That landed harder than any prediction could have. Because buried underneath the question about your finances was another question your soulmate had avoided for much longer. Had they judged you during a season when you needed understanding? And if they had, what had that judgment cost them? Your soulmate left the reading without a lottery number, a prophecy, or some supernatural confirmation that millions were waiting for you. Instead, they left with a more unsettling realization. They needed facts. Real ones. And once they started looking at the past honestly, small details began changing meaning. The first came from an old conversation still buried in their phone. They had opened your message thread dozens of times before. Usually, nostalgia pulled them there. Sometimes regret. Sometimes loneliness. This time they searched for a specific phrase. They remembered you once saying, "I just need to get through the next few months." Back then, your soulmate had responded with something simple. "You'll be fine." They had almost forgotten the conversation. But now they scrolled upward. And there it was. A message from you a few minutes earlier. You had mentioned taking on extra work. Not because you wanted more spending money. Because somebody close to you needed help. Your soulmate stared at the screen. The memory returned in pieces. You had been tired that month. More distracted. Less available. And instead of asking why, they had slowly convinced themselves that your reduced attention meant your feelings were fading. It was the first reversal. What they had interpreted as emotional distance may have been exhaustion. And the question became worse from there. How many times had they demanded reassurance from you while you were quietly trying to hold your life together? They kept scrolling. Another memory surfaced. There had been a weekend trip. Nothing extravagant. Just 2 nights away. Your soulmate had wanted you to come. You declined. They remembered being hurt by how quickly you said no. They had even told a friend, if they wanted to be here, they'd find a way. For months, they had used that weekend as evidence. Evidence that they cared more. Evidence that you weren't committed enough. Evidence that you always had an excuse. Now they remembered something else. 2 days after the trip, you had sent them a photograph. It was ordinary. A cup of coffee beside a laptop. Your soulmate had barely noticed the background at the time. But when they found the photo again, they noticed the time stamp. 2:14 in the morning. You had been working. While they had been telling themselves you didn't value the relationship enough to spend a weekend with them, you had been awake past 2 trying to solve a problem you never wanted them to carry for you. The photograph suddenly felt different. And they hated how long it had taken them to see it. But that wasn't the shocking part. Not yet. A few days later, your soulmate ran into someone who had known you during that period. The conversation was not planned. Your name came up almost accidentally. Your soulmate tried to sound casual. Were things really that difficult for them back then? The person looked surprised. You didn't know? That question made your soulmate's stomach tighten. Know what? There was a pause. Then came the truth. You had been under significant financial pressure. But not because you were reckless. Not because you refused to work. Not because you were secretly expecting someone to save you. You were trying to protect something. Maybe helping family. Maybe recovering from an unexpected expense. Maybe rebuilding after a professional setback. Maybe paying down something that had followed you longer than anyone realized. The specific numbers were not the important part. The important part was what you did next. You didn't turn the relationship into a rescue mission. You didn't hand your problems to your soulmate and demand that they fix them. You quietly cut back. You worked. You sacrificed. And perhaps most painfully, you became increasingly uncomfortable every time you felt your struggles being mistaken for a lack of ambition. The person speaking to your soulmate remembered one conversation in particular. You said something once, they explained. What? You said you'd rather disappear for a while than stay somewhere you were beginning to feel like a burden. Your soulmate went completely still. Because they remembered the final months differently. They remembered you becoming quieter. They remembered you pulling back. They remembered asking, "Why don't you let me in anymore?" And they remembered your answer. Because I don't want every difficult thing in my life to become the reason you look at me differently. At the time, they became defensive. I don't look at you differently. But now they wondered whether you had already noticed something they hadn't been brave enough to admit. Maybe it was the tone they used when you talked about work. Maybe it was how often they compared your progress to other people's. Maybe it was the little jokes about money that didn't feel little to you. Maybe it was the way they offered help with an edge of superiority rather than partnership. Love can survive hard seasons. But dignity becomes exhausted when someone feels constantly evaluated. And you were becoming exhausted. Your soulmate went home that night and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the television. Their phone was beside them. Your contact was still saved. For several minutes, they did nothing. Then they opened a blank message. I heard something about what you were going through back then. They stared at it. Deleted it. Started again. I think I owe you an apology. Deleted that too. Because suddenly they understood that an apology could not be written quickly enough to make the past disappear. There was something deeper they needed to understand first. Had you struggled financially? Yes. But that wasn't the shocking truth. The shocking truth was how seriously they had underestimated the person you were becoming during that struggle. While they had been measuring your life from the outside, you had been learning things money could not instantly buy. How to survive uncertainty without collapsing. How to say no. How to stop spending money trying to look successful. How to stop explaining every decision to people committed to misunderstanding you. How to separate self-worth from income. How to build slowly without announcing every step. And perhaps most importantly, how to become emotionally independent from people who only felt comfortable loving you when your life looked easy. That change had continued after the relationship ended. Your soulmate began hearing small things. Not rumors about sudden riches. Not some fantasy about you waking up wealthy overnight. Something more believable. You were rebuilding. Different habits. Different priorities. Different boundaries. Maybe a better opportunity had appeared. Maybe you had learned a skill. Maybe you changed your work situation. Maybe you finally stopped rescuing everyone else at your own expense. Maybe you had started saving quietly. Maybe you simply gained control over a part of your life that once frightened you. And the more your soulmate heard, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Because they had assumed that if you ever became stronger, you would come back looking for their approval. Instead, your growth seemed to be making you less dependent on it. That was the second reversal. Your soulmate once worried that you needed too much from them. Now they were beginning to wonder whether you needed anything from them at all. A week after the psychic reading, they met a close friend for coffee. The friend knew something had been bothering them. Finally, they asked, "Why are you suddenly talking about them again?" Your soulmate looked toward the window. "I think I got something wrong." "What?" "A lot." The friend waited. Your soulmate struggled to say the next part. "I thought they left because they couldn't handle their life." The friend shook their head slightly. "And now?" "I think they left because they were tired of feeling like they had to prove their worth to me." Silence. Then the friend asked the question they had been trying not to ask themselves. "If that's true, what are you going to do about it?" Your soulmate looked down at the phone in their hand. "I don't know." "Do you want them back?" The answer came too quickly. "Yes." Then they stopped. Because for the first time, that answer sounded incomplete. Wanting you back was easy. Missing you was easy. Looking at old photographs was easy. Feeling guilty in a quiet room was easy. The difficult question was whether they had become capable of loving you without turning the relationship into a scoreboard. Without comparing careers. Without using money to define maturity. Without withdrawing affection when life became inconvenient. Without expecting you to explain every difficult season in a way that made them comfortable. The friend seemed to understand the silence. So they said quietly, "Maybe the question isn't whether you want them back." Your soulmate looked up. "Maybe it's whether you're ready to meet who they are now." That sentence followed them home. Because you were not standing in the same emotional place where they left you. There may have been a time when one message from them could change your entire day. A time when you checked your phone too often. A time when you replayed conversations, wondering what you could have done differently. A time when you would have accepted almost any explanation simply because you wanted the pain to stop. But difficult seasons teach strange forms of freedom. At first, you may have wanted them to understand you. Then you realized understanding could not be forced. You wanted them to recognize what you had been carrying. Then you realized your struggle did not become more honorable simply because somebody else finally acknowledged it. You wanted an apology. Then one day you noticed you could sleep without it. That was your transformation. Not becoming cold. Not becoming incapable of love. Becoming unwilling to abandon yourself just because someone you cared about was uncertain. Your financial life may still not be perfect. Your future may still contain unanswered questions. But the person who once felt ashamed of not having everything figured out is no longer as easy to intimidate. You have learned that stability is not merely the number in an account. It is also knowing you can make a difficult decision without betraying your values. It is learning when to spend and when to wait. When to help and when helping has become self-destruction. When to stay and when staying has become a negotiation against your own dignity. And your soulmate can feel that difference. Not psychically. Not magically. Through the ordinary evidence people leave behind when they genuinely change. The way you no longer chase conversations. The way you don't react to every silence. The way you are less interested in proving that you are doing well. The way your life no longer appears arranged around whether they return. That frightened them more than your old financial struggle ever did. Because the third reversal was now impossible to ignore. They had once believed time was on their side. They believed that if they eventually came back, you would still be emotionally waiting. But growth had introduced a consequence they never considered. You might still care. And still say no. That realization changed the message they finally began writing. The first version said, "I miss you." They erased it. "Too easy." The second said, "I heard you've been doing well." They erased that too. It sounded like they were measuring you again. The third version began differently. "I owe you an apology for the way I interpreted what you were going through." They kept that sentence. Then another. "I made assumptions when I should have asked questions." They stopped typing. The old version of them wanted to explain. To say they had been worried. To say money frightened them because of their own past. To say they only wanted stability. Some of that might even have been true. But explanations can become hiding places when they are used too quickly. So they kept going. "I think there were times when I made you feel as if your difficult season said something about your character. I can see now that I confused circumstances with who you were." They read it twice. Their heart was beating harder now. Then came the sentence they almost didn't write. "You didn't owe me financial perfection to deserve respect." That was the real truth the psychic conversation had forced them toward. Not whether you would become wealthy. Not whether success was destined for you. Not whether the two of you were guaranteed some dramatic reunion. The truth was that they had allowed fear about money to distort how they treated someone they loved. And now, your progress was making that mistake impossible to excuse. Yet there was still one more revelation. Your soulmate eventually spoke again with the person who had first mentioned your difficult financial season. This time they asked directly. "Why didn't they tell me everything?" The person answered carefully. "They wanted to." "Then why didn't they?" "Because every time they tried, the conversation became about whether they were doing enough." Your soulmate looked away. The person continued. "They weren't afraid you'd discover they were struggling. They were afraid you'd confirm what they were already afraid of, that struggling made them less worthy of being chosen." That sentence stripped away the final defense. Because now your soulmate remembered one of your last arguments. You had said, "I don't need you to fix this." They replied, "Then what do you want from me?" You were quiet for a long time. Then you said, "I want to feel like I'm still the same person to you while I'm figuring it out." At the time, your soulmate thought you were avoiding practical reality. Now they understood. You had never asked them to ignore reality. You had asked them not to confuse your bank balance with your value. And maybe that is where the relationship actually began breaking. Not during the final goodbye. Not during the silence afterward. But during the smaller moments when emotional safety disappeared. This was the biggest reversal. The story was no longer about whether your soulmate still cared. They clearly cared enough to revisit what happened. It was no longer about whether you still had feelings. Feelings could survive for years and still not build a healthy relationship. The deeper question had become whether your soulmate had changed enough to love you differently. Could they sit beside you during uncertainty without making you feel defective? Could they celebrate your progress without competing with it? Could they talk honestly about finances without using money as emotional power? Could they admit fear without turning fear into judgment? Could they support you without controlling you? Could they respect the fact that you had learned how to survive without them? And if you chose not to reopen the door, could they honor that too? That was where accountability became more important than longing. Your soulmate did not send the message immediately. For once, hesitation was not avoidance. It was restraint. They knew that reaching out simply to relieve their guilt would make the apology about them again. So they asked themselves what they were actually prepared to do if you responded. If you were angry, could they listen without defending themselves? If you said you had moved on, could they respect it? If you asked why it took so long, could they answer without blaming circumstances? If you opened the door slightly, could they move slowly enough to rebuild trust rather than rushing toward the comfort of being forgiven? Those questions mattered more than whether they could write something beautiful. Because apologies are not proven by the emotion behind them. They are proven by what a person does after hearing the consequences of their behavior. Eventually, your soulmate returned to the unfinished message. They added one final paragraph. I don't know what your life looks like now, and I don't want to pretend I have the right to step back into it. I only wanted to acknowledge something I should have understood earlier. You were carrying more than I knew, and instead of making it easier to be honest with me, I sometimes made it harder. I'm sorry. Then they stopped. No promise of forever. No claim that destiny demanded another chance. No pressure. No request that you answer immediately. Just truth. Their thumb hovered over the screen. And whether they eventually press send is not the most important part of this story. Because somewhere between the question they asked that psychic and the apology they finally became capable of writing, the meaning of your past changed. They went looking for information about your money. They discovered something about their own character. They wanted to know whether you would become financially successful. They were forced to confront why your worth had ever become entangled with that question. They wondered whether you still needed them. They discovered that perhaps the person they should have been afraid of losing was the version of you who once kept waiting for their approval. That version of you has been changing. Quietly. Not perfectly. Not overnight. But enough. And perhaps there is something deeply spiritual in that kind of transformation. Sometimes prayer does not immediately return the person you lost. Sometimes it reveals what the loss was trying to teach you. Sometimes God's timing is not about placing two people back together as quickly as possible. Sometimes it is about allowing both people enough distance to see the patterns they could not recognize while they were living inside them. Forgiveness may become possible. A conversation may become possible. Even reconciliation may become possible. But none of those things require you to return to the emotional position you once occupied. You can listen without surrendering your boundaries. You can forgive without pretending nothing happened. You can care about someone while still requiring consistency. You can recognize that a person has changed without immediately handing them access to your heart. And you can love someone deeply while accepting that love must eventually become behavior if it is going to remain in your life. Remember the question from that quiet room. The psychic had asked your soulmate. What do you actually know? At first, they thought she meant your financial situation. Now the question means something entirely different. What do they actually know about you? They know you have struggled. They know you kept more inside than they realized. They know they misunderstood some of your silence. They know you tried to preserve your dignity. They know you are becoming less dependent on their validation. And most importantly, they now know that loving you again, if that opportunity ever comes, cannot mean returning to the old relationship. It would require meeting you differently. With curiosity instead of assumptions. Respect instead of evaluation. Conversation instead of silent judgment. Consistency instead of emotional guessing games. And partnership instead of rescue. That is the truth they never expected to discover when they started asking about your money. Your greatest value was never hidden in what you had. It was revealed in who you became when life forced you to rebuild. And anyone who wishes to walk beside you now will have to learn the difference.